So we are recording this webinar, and if you have any questions or technical issues that come up during the presentation, feel free to type those in the chat box. And if you want your comment to go to everyone so everyone can see a question, for example, feel free to use the drop-down menu and select all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, it just goes to us as panelists. So I want to say welcome to Kara Napolitano from the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, and let her introduce herself. And I'm gonna turn off my video, but I will be here, and like I said, I will look at the chat box and let me know if y'all need anything.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining the webinar and kind of spending your lunch break on this really super heavy topic. But I guess considering the work that you do, they're all pretty heavy topics. So I guess, yeah, I should introduce myself. I work for an organization called the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, and we're a Denver-based nonprofit, but we are a statewide organization, and we've been doing anti-trafficking work since 2005. I joined the team about 5 years ago, after having done quite a bit of similar work overseas. So I was working in Africa and in several countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and in South Asia for about a decade, doing work that could kind of qualify as anti-trafficking work, but not necessarily for an anti-trafficking organization. So I was, working with child soldiers, working with internally displaced peoples, refugees and asylees, and all of the areas, locations that I was working in, people were experiencing exploitation. And that, sort of looks different there than it does here. And in some ways, we don't have child soldiers here in Colorado. In some places, I was coming across people who were selling sex to meet their survival needs, which is very common in the United States, or trading sex to meet their survival needs, or who were selling their children into marriages at very young ages because they couldn't afford to feed them. So, these are all different forms of exploitation, some of which kind of border on human trafficking. And so when I came back to the US 6 years ago, I think now, I still had that perception, as I suspect some of you may have, that trafficking was like this thing that happens in this other place outside of my own community. And I really dug into what trafficking looked like here in Colorado and realized that I was very wrong. And actually a lot of the, while the actual types of trafficking that we see may be different and diverse here in Colorado, the root causes are really similar, right? We're talking about poverty, systemic inequality, homelessness, racism, lack of job opportunity, that leads people into risky situations where they're forced to make choices to meet their survival needs that someone could exploit. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is kind of exploiting vulnerabilities and how that can turn into trafficking. But recognizing the kind of work that you all do, working in the domestic violence and sexual assault space, I'll be sure to make all of this conversation relevant to you. And so by the end of this hour, what I'm hoping is that you can understand the nuances that distinguish trafficking from other crimes, and being really clear that I'm never saying that trafficking, the experience of trafficking or exploitation, is somehow worse than or better than some other experience, but people are kind of floating in and out of these experiences of exploitation. Often they are experiencing exploitation in conjunction with other crimes or exploitative experiences. So someone might be experiencing human trafficking and sexual assault and domestic violence and child abuse, but not necessarily all at the same time. So we want you to be able to understand the differences, and so that you can understand what resources are available, the kinds of mental health resources that someone might need to recover from the kind of complex trauma that someone will experience when they have that lived experience of trafficking, those kinds of things. There's also legal frameworks that you can kind of follow to support somebody who's experienced trafficking if they want to go the criminal justice route. But all of the training and experience that you have within the domestic violence and sexual assault space is really vital to this conversation as well. So this isn't a brand new conversation. We want you to be thinking about Stockholm syndrome, trauma, and trauma bonding, because that really plays into this complexity around disclosure and really understanding your own lived experience. So many survivors don't realize that what they've experienced is in fact human trafficking. And I will say that that is partially to do with all of these myths and misconceptions that are kind of circling in the media and in Hollywood and in social media now around trafficking. There's a lot of sensationalized imagery and really just misinformation that's out there. So we do want you to also be able to understand or identify the red flags and behavioral cues, but still keeping in mind how complex that can be when you don't have someone who self-identifies. And then the last bullet point here is just understanding the development of protocols. Having those protocols in place for when you do make an identification is super important. You know, I've been training people here in Colorado on human trafficking for a few years, and the most common refrain that I hear is, you know, now that I've had this training, I realize that I've in fact come across a survivor of trafficking in the past and didn't realize it. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do with it. I knew something was up. I didn't necessarily know it was trafficking, but I didn't know what to do. So when you have those protocols in place, when you understand the importance of multi-sector collaboration, and you know what other resources are out there and around in your community to refer to or to draw information from, then you're a lot more empowered to make those identifications. So if you could put into the chat, kind of what words or phrases come to mind when you hear the term human trafficking? Like, what are we talking about here? Who are we talking about? You know, what populations get trafficked? What experiences might they have? What words or phrases come to mind? Even what media comes to mind, or what movies? You know, what do you know about trafficking? Okay, yeah, so I see slavery, exploitation, which you've already heard me say like 20 times, so I'm sorry about that. Young girls and women. Anything else out of the country? Yeah, and I've already kind of alluded to that. Trans women of color. Yeah, thank you, Heather. That's not actually something that usually comes into the chat, but is absolutely true. We see the trans identity in general just kind of left out of the conversation so frequently. And it's yet another kind of layer of vulnerability that we see to being trafficked. So thank you for that. Forced labor with a commercial component. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, Sabrina. We are definitely going to talk about both labor and sex trafficking. I realize, sort of because of the nature of again, of your work, that it's likely that you're thinking about sex trafficking, and that's also what's in the media. And the fact is, there's just significantly more labor trafficking than most people are aware of, and even more so than sex trafficking, not only in Colorado, but the world over. So thank you for bringing that up. Partner exploitation. Yeah, when it comes to trafficking, another myth or misconception that's out there is that people are kind of snatched off the street by people they don't know. And that's just simply, again, not the case. It is the case in the movie Taken, I realize, but it's not what we see very frequently on the ground. It's much more frequently either partner exploitation or parental or somebody in the family or an employer, somebody that somebody knows. So yeah, thank you for all of that participation, everyone. So I just wanted to kind of get a feel for what we were thinking about here. So the term trafficking, and I'm just going to do this quickly so you can understand the statutes and how kind of new this movement is. The term human trafficking was first defined in the year 2000 at a legal level. So we first wrote human trafficking laws into statute only 20 years ago. But of course, it was always happening, right? Exploitation of humans has been happening since the beginning of humans. And so before the year 2000, we were calling it other things. We were calling it forced migration, forced labor, forced prostitution, child prostitution. And then in the year 2000, we kind of collected all of those forms of exploitation under this blanket term of human trafficking. So it really encompasses a lot. And also what we have from that kind of that really nascent movement or legislation is this really old crime with this really new framework for a response. And so what that means is that most people, just kind of in general, who would likely to be coming into contact with a survivor of trafficking, haven't had a human trafficking training. And that might include you all. You know, if I was in a room with you, I'd ask you to raise hands on who's had a trafficking training. But you know, in this kind of group, I'm guessing it's probably around 30 or 40% of you have had a training. In healthcare settings and child welfare spaces and community groups and, you know, homeless shelters and even law enforcement, I really get around 5 or 10% response. And a lot of the literature that's out there backs that up. So those populations that are likely to be able to identify a survivor of trafficking usually haven't had that training to understand those nuances. So again, thank you for being here today. So in that year 2000, at the international level, at the UN level, we wrote this initial definition of human trafficking. So what you're looking at on the screen here is an abbreviated version. It says that human trafficking is a severe form of exploitation for labor, which includes sex as a form of labor, like stripping for money, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So two important things about this international definition, because we defined it a little bit differently in the US, is that sex is a form of labor. We have different values around sex in the US, so we didn't include sex as a form of labor in our federal definition. And then this element of force or fraud or coercion or some combination thereof have to be present for it to be trafficking on this international scale. Just to give you some quick numbers here, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, estimates that there are around 40 million victims of human trafficking in the world today at any given day. Of that 40 million, I'm going to break it down a little bit. About 15 million of them are in forced marriages, and the other 25 million are in forced labor, which includes sex as a form of labor. So that includes sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Of that 25 million, it's estimated that between 19 and 20 million are in labor trafficking, and between 5 and 6 are in sex trafficking. Okay, so that's pretty significantly different than what like the media would have you believe, right? That all trafficking is sex trafficking. We certainly have sex trafficking in the US and in Colorado, but we also have labor trafficking. And so we're going to focus on both. And that's also because we see people experiencing both at the same time. So I kind of mentioned that people might be experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault and also trafficking. They also may be experiencing wage theft or other kinds of labor violations, all kind of alongside each other. So this next slide that you're looking at is an abbreviated definition of our federal law. So that's called the TVPA. It's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We wrote this law in the year 2000 as well. So this is a little bit different than what you saw on the previous slide. And so I want to spend a little bit of time here because this is also important to distinguishing the crime from other crimes and to your mandatory reporting requirements. Okay, so we parsed out the definition into 3 categories. We said that those who are under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex acts are different from those who are 18 and over. So we made an exception to the force, fraud, or coercion rule. We decided as a society by writing the law the way that we did that anyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex acts is by definition a victim of trafficking, regardless of how they self-identify, regardless if there's any element of force or fraud or coercion. So in other words, there can be a trafficking victim without a trafficker, according to this law. It's complicated. It's also complicated because it's difficult to tell somebody they're a victim of something when that's not how they self-identify. So it's likely, given the nature of your work, again, that many of you have met somebody who's under the age of 18 that is trading sex to meet their survival needs in some way. and no one's forcing them to do it. You could argue that like society's forcing them to do it, or their circumstances, constrained choice is forcing them to do it, but that's not how our laws are written. If no human is forcing or frauding or coercing someone to do something, then they're not being forced or frauded or coerced. But what we're saying is, regardless of all of that, under the age of 18, involved in any version of commercial sex, by definition, a victim of trafficking. What it also means is that they're protected from being arrested for crimes that they're, quote, being forced to commit as a result of their trafficking. So if someone's under the age of 18 and they're selling sex, like prostitution, for whatever reason, they can't be arrested for the crime of prostitution. They, in fact, should be treated as a victim, again, regardless of the fact that there's no trafficker. There may be a sex buyer, but no one that's forcing or frauding or coercing them into doing the sex act. And so that's an interesting and complex way of explaining this. The commercial component means trading anything of value. So it could be money, but it could also be a place to stay, drugs, a ride, protection, anything of value makes something commercial. And I use the example of prostitution, but it's any sex act. So, pornography, stripping, webcamming, any commercial sex act under the age of 18 is a trafficking case. It gets complex when they're 18 and over. So someone goes from 17 years, 362 days, and then 6 days later they're quote unquote an adult. That's complicated. Again, another complication of our law. Nothing else has changed in their circumstances. If nobody is forcing or frauding or coercing them into trading sex for this something of value, then they are in fact selling sex illegally and can now be arrested for prostitution. So that's complicated. The other piece is if somebody is being forced or frauded or coerced, right? If they are in fact being trafficked and they're doing this against their will, it's really, really hard to prove all of this. People, again, as I mentioned in the previous slides, that most people are being trafficked by someone they know and love, or just someone that they know, like an employer. And so that identifying the force of the fraud or the coercion, especially the coercion, is hard to do, right? People love their traffickers because their traffickers are their parents or their guardian or their boyfriend or their husband or their uncle. And so identifying coercion and as coercion and disclosing that to a service provider or law enforcement in order to, result in protection or to not get arrested, that's really complex and hard to do. It's hard to get somebody to self-identify, even if you really think they're experiencing trafficking, but it's also hard to prove any of this. Even if somebody does self-identify as a victim of trafficking, it's really hard to prove a lot of this in the court of law. And so a lot of times when people are arrested for trafficking crimes, they're not in fact prosecuted for them because it's so hard to prove. And so our numbers, like the numbers of prosecutions that we have in the state, for example, really don't reflect the number of cases that we have, if that makes sense. So a lot of complexity in these first two categories, and really even more than I've just covered. And then the third category is forced labor. So we see forced labor in so many industries here in Colorado. So we see it in agriculture and ranching, in energy and construction, landscaping, domestic servitude, nannying. We see it in restaurants and hotels and hospitality in general. So it's much more common than we realize for people to not be getting paid or not be getting paid nearly what they should be, and also experiencing coercion and not being allowed to leave those situations. But we don't only see it in these regular industries, as I mentioned, we also see it in irregular or illicit markets. So we see people, for example, being forced to mule people across the drugs across the southern border. Someone being forced by, say, a gang in Central America to mule drugs across the border into the US under threats of extreme violence to their family members, for example. That would be forced labor. But you'd have to prove those elements of force, fraud, or coercion, and you'd also have to get the victim to disclose that they were being forced or frauded or coerced into that situation. And if they're, in the US talking to a US Border Patrol agent who maybe hasn't had human trafficking training it's highly unlikely that they're going to disclose that because the gang is still in their hometown threatening the lives of their loved ones, right? And so a lot of people are in fact prosecuted for crimes that they're forced to commit as a result of their trafficking, not because, you know, we want to do that, but because we just simply miss it. We see people being forced to sell drugs on the street here in Colorado against their will. We see the intersection of sex and labor trafficking when someone is being forced to sell sex against their will and then also forced to rob the person they're selling sex to. That would be both forced labor and sex trafficking. So we see it in a lot of places that we wouldn't normally think. Forced begging, like begging on the street, forced breaking and entering, all kinds of criminal activity that can also be elements of forced labor. And then there's this shout out here to that this isn't limited to those who are foreign born youth or females. This is just a shout out to some of these misconceptions. You know, we often think of something that is this is something that's happening either out of the country or to people who were from somewhere else and have been brought in to be sold in the US. It's just simply not the case. So it's about 50%, 50-50 here in Colorado, 50% domestic, 50% foreign national. And I'm getting my statistics from law enforcement as well as service providers. But being foreign born is certainly a vulnerability, right? In the year 2020, we have, I can't even tell you, maybe 9 or 10 new immigration policies that are pushing an already marginalized population further underground, less likely to report potential violence being perpetrated against them. We've got an uptick of nationalism and xenophobia. So it is certainly a vulnerability to be foreign born or to be an immigrant in the US, but it's certainly not the only folks who are being trafficked. Being a youth is a vulnerability, sure. But if we think back to those statistics that I told you earlier, the ILO also estimates that about a quarter of victims are under the age of 18 of those 40 million. And that is quite a lot. And that is something to be concerned about. But the majority of victims are actually adults. And it's a lot harder to prosecute those cases in the US because of our, because of the kind of the burden of proof of force, fraud, or coercion. But being a youth is certainly a vulnerability. You know, youth are supposed to do what adults say. Youth's brains aren't fully developed yet. So we know between the ages of 13 and 25, while the brain is in that stage of development, that young people are just simply more likely to make risky choices. They're physiologically more likely to make risky choices. They're also more vulnerable online and in other settings. And it's certainly not limited to females. Of the sex trafficking, so of those 6 million or so sex trafficking cases that the ILO estimates, they estimate that 75% of those sex trafficking cases are female, but that leaves 25% for transgender and male victims. That's a lot. I mean, that 25% of 6 million, you can do the math there. But it's something that we just tend to overlook. And then within the labor trafficking space, it's around 50-50 male, female. We have some markets that kind of lend themselves to more exploitation of males, like say construction, and some that lend themselves to exploitation of females, like domestic servitude. So we're going to try to get rid of some of these myths and misconceptions and try to redefine what trafficking really looks like. And one way to do that is through this action means purpose model. So one thing from each one of these categories has to be present for it to be trafficking. And then this is also how we're gonna spend a little time here differentiating trafficking from other crimes from a legal perspective. So there has to first be an action, and by far the most common action is recruitment. So somebody is specifically targeted because of a vulnerability that they have. It could be part of their identity, it could be part of their community lived experience, it could be that they suffer some kind of trauma, it could be just an economic need, but somebody's vulnerability is spotted by a trafficker and they're recruited because of that vulnerability. That recruitment could be online, it could be in person. We see peer-to-peer recruitment, kids getting sent into schools to recruit their peers, kids getting sent into group homes to recruit their peers. We see peer-to-peer recruitment in homeless shelters. We also see recruitment in schools. I mean, we've had several cases of teachers or coaches that have identified vulnerable kids and trafficked them, priests even. So it's really this power dynamic that we see very frequently. And again, the overwhelming majority of trafficking cases are people who are being trafficked by someone that they know and love. So familial trafficking is much more common than we know. Intimate partner trafficking as well. So recruitment is probably the most common. Harbor, less so. So harbor is, locked up, chained up. It's what Google would have us believe is happening to all trafficking victims. It's simply not the case. And again, be thinking back to the interpersonal violence trainings that you've had. People really don't need to be locked up to stay in exploitative situations. They simply don't. And so sometimes they are. We've all seen horrific cases of that. But it's not what we usually see. It's not what you should necessarily be looking for. Transportation is another one. So we tend to think that transportation is necessary for it to be trafficking. It's kind of the nature of the word trafficking, but it's not. Sometimes people are trafficked across an international border for sure, sometimes across a state border, sometimes across town to a motel. But if someone is being trafficked by their parent, they certainly don't need to be transported anywhere. So someone might be, trafficked out of their own home in Denver and never leave Denver. Someone could be provided. That's like, I trade access to my kids to you in exchange for rent because otherwise we'll be evicted, or in exchange for drugs to support my drug habit. We've seen an uptick of this alongside the opioid crisis, and we expect to see an uptick of this as the moratorium on evictions are lifted. And then there's obtained, and then that's really the kidnapping, the Taken movie, snatched off the street. And in my 15 or so years of doing this work, I've really not met anybody who that was their experience. Could it happen? I'm sure, yes, and I'm sure that it has. But usually people know their trafficker. The means is through force or fraud or coercion, and I'm going to talk through what I mean by that in just a minute. But the big star is to remind us that we made an exception. So there does not have to be an element of force, fraud, or coercion if the person is under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex. And then the purpose is for commercial sex or labor or services. So at its core, what often differentiates trafficking from other crimes is profit. There has to be like a commercial component to the experience for it to be trafficking. So let me talk through an example, and it's not a very nice example, I admit, but someone may be being sexually assaulted by their father, let's say. So if they're being sexually assaulted by their father, that would be domestic violence, that would be child abuse, that would also be sexual assault, but it wouldn't necessarily be trafficking. But it could be if the father was like videotaping it and putting it online and selling that for a profit, or inviting his friends over and allowing them to pay for access to the child as well. So there would be like an element of profit there, and that would make that experience all four of those things. Including trafficking, but it doesn't necessarily mean that someone is being trafficked. There has to be that commercial component. Within the labor space, people have often asked, and I struggle with this even explaining it, but what is the difference between wage theft and labor trafficking? Usually the difference between, wage theft is not getting paid for your work, which is very similar to labor trafficking. The difference would be, let's say somebody is working as a dishwasher in a restaurant, and let's just say, for the sake of the example, that the person is undocumented. Well, if the owner of the restaurant says, work here, I'll pay you under the table, you'll get paid, $12 an hour, and you work 6 days a week, and then that person does that work, and at the end of the 2 weeks when they're supposed to get paid, the owner of the restaurant says, yeah, I'm not going to pay you. And what are you going to do about it? You're undocumented and no one cares, and I'm a respected business owner and no one's going to believe you. If that person can walk out the door and go get a lawyer and sue that person for wage theft, then that would be an example of wage theft. If, however, that person feels they cannot walk out that door because either the door is locked, or because the person, has confiscated their passport, or has threatened to call ICE on their family members if they report, then that would be a case of trafficking. So that's where that can get a little gray, but that's a pretty solid example. So what do I mean by force, fraud, or coercion? Force is easy to picture. Force is physical force, locking someone in. Someone who's being forced to stay at the location where they work should always be a red flag. So when you have clients who, when you have clients, you're usually seeing someone who's experienced some form of violence, domestic violence or sexual assault. If they disclose to you that they're being forced to live where they work, that should be a red flag for potential trafficking as well. It doesn't mean that everyone who lives where they work is being trafficked, but if they're getting paid an exorbitant amount of money to live in housing that has, 12 people in a room, if they're locked in, if they're not allowed to leave, if they don't have access to running water or, other basic necessities, these can be pretty big red flags of potential trafficking. Fraud, being promised something and given something else. So, it could be a fraudulent job opportunity or getting paid a certain amount of money. But it could also be a fraudulent promise of love, right? I'm going to love and take care of you. I'm going to get you out of that abusive household that you grew up in. Come with me. And then once you leave that abusive household, you're told you have to work to pay your keep or pay your stay or pay for the travel. And you're either put to work or forced to sell sex against your will. So it could be fraudulent promises of work or of love, doing work that wasn't part of the original deal. And then there's coercion. So if like force or fraud are sometimes part of an experience, I would say coercion pretty much always is. Threatening to report someone to the authorities could look like a lot of things. So think about your clients here. Somebody could, if the person was a young person, they could be told, if you disclose, you're going to get arrested because the things you've been doing are illegal. They could be told, they'll call Child Protective Services. They'll take you away from me. You'll destroy the family. They'll arrest me if they're being trafficked by a parent or guardian. They could be, they could, on the other hand, be undocumented or have family members who are undocumented and be told, if you disclose what's happened to you, I'll have your family deported. No one's going to believe you. I've had cases of people being videotaped doing things that they didn't want to do, and told that they would, the trafficker has told them that they would publish the video in some way on Facebook or send it to their parents or send it to their school. So there's lots of different ways that someone could threaten to report someone to the authorities. Threatening to harm a family member, that one's pretty obvious, do this, or we're gonna make your little sister do it, something like that. Yeah, someone who's been recruited by a terrorist, that's a tough one. If they're buying into that ideology, generally we have not historically prosecuted those crimes as human trafficking crimes. We've prosecuted them as other crimes like fraud. But I think, Aberdeen, I agree that it's possible that a terrorist group could be trafficking folks, and certainly they have been. ISIS was trafficking folks for sexual purposes, and forcing people into marriages, and that would be a trafficking situation. But and then we've had cases like child soldiers who are recruited and then forced to commit horrible crimes. Those are cases of trafficking. But if somebody like buys into the ideology and becomes a terrorist, it's kind of like questionable. There's some gray in our laws, but thank you for that question. Does a person have control over their own ID? That should be a big red flag, especially if people are seeking services from you, and you notice somebody giving somebody their ID back. That would be a really big red flag. Why? There's really no reason why somebody would have somebody else's ID. It's not legal to confiscate passports in a labor trafficking situation, or like in a labor situation where somebody has a work visa. You can't take people's passports, but we see it with pimps as well, where IDs will be confiscated and held onto. It's like a feeling of ownership over somebody else. So someone who doesn't have control over their own ID, that should be a red flag. And then there's this piece of debt bondage here. And I will say that in my experience, debt bondage is a huge part of trafficking. It's actual or like supposed debt. Like, I owe them so much. They took care of me. They gave me a job when no one else would. They helped me get into the US. They're my parents, so I owe them. They're my, my brother or sister. Those kinds of debts, we hear those a lot. Sometimes they're real debt, like I owe someone money because they fronted me drugs, or because they paid for my recruitment fees and I owe them $6,000. But then we see that debt being used as a coercive tactic to force people to do things that they don't want to do or that are illegal or that kind of thing. So, having a debt to somebody doesn't mean you have to do everything that they say, but that's how it's leveraged. We see debt bondage play out in a couple of different ways in Colorado. So like I said, really often in these, like I owe them, they gave me a place to stay, or I'd otherwise be on the street, so I owe them, that kind of thing. But another way we see it play out is when a smuggling situation can turn into a trafficking situation. So I just want to differentiate between smuggling and trafficking here, because the media does a really poor job of it. They often conflate the terms, like people were smuggled and trafficked as if it's the same thing. And it's really not. So smuggling is consensual, right? If I pay someone to take me across the border, I consent to being taken across the border. I pay them $5,000, they take me across. Yes, it's illegal. And you're undocumented once you get into the US, but it's not trafficking, right? No one was forced to have sex or do labor against their will so someone else could profit off of it, right? They were just brought somewhere. So that's smuggling, but smuggling can turn into trafficking. And we do see it happen where a smuggler, is dishonest about what they promise, or they get to the border and the border's closed right now, for example, and there's a massive law enforcement presence there. And so they have to take a much more roundabout route. And, when they get into the US, the smuggler says, that took longer than expected, and you owe me an additional $3,000 that you clearly don't have in your pocket. And so I'm going to take you to the place where you're going to work off your debt. So they're basically being enslaved. I mean, they're taken to a restaurant in Colorado, let's say in Grand Junction, and just forced to work off this debt that they didn't agree to, pretty much indefinitely, because the smuggler who's now turned into a trafficker knows that they're undocumented, right? Knows they don't have anywhere to run to, has taken them somewhere where they might not even know what state they're in, doesn't speak the language, doesn't know their rights. The trafficker probably knows where their family lives and can threaten their families in other countries. So there's so many reasons why people can't really leave these situations, and they're forced to pay off this quote unquote debt. So this is how we see force, fraud, and coercion play out. Do feel free to put some questions into the chat. Just because we only have an hour, I'm just going to keep going, but I will make sure that I leave time at the end too. But as we go along, please feel free to put questions in. So, I think I've been trying to give you some scenarios of how this plays out on the ground. But again, be thinking about the vulnerabilities of the folks that you work with. What is pushing them into risky situations where they're forced to make choices just to meet their basic survival needs, the same needs that we all have, and who might be watching that play out and able to exploit that vulnerability. So somebody who's suffered from abuse or neglect or isolation in their past, it could be a young person, or it could be an older person who experienced that in their past and hasn't healed. And is looking for love and looking for a relationship and not finding it at home, or maybe doesn't have a healthy version of what a healthy relationship looks like, right? A lot of your clients, and somebody reaches in and just says, here, I'm here for you. I love you. You're beautiful. I'll take care of you. Come with me, right? It could be a mentoring type relationship. It could be a romantic type relationship. But, if we're being honest with ourselves, all humans are looking for a relationship with other humans. And so it's very, it's very natural to lean into that new relationship opportunity. And someone could exploit that vulnerability. Or if someone's experiencing homelessness, I mean, it's cold. It's cold in Colorado. It's about to get colder, and it's dangerous on the street. And if it's cold and dangerous, and someone says, "Hey, there's this house up the street where we can crash," they just make us work for them a little bit. You might be willing to go check that out. What kind of work do I have to do? Anything to get off the street, I'm willing, right? So people can make these risky choices, and someone can exploit that vulnerability. Could be this third one, poverty, debts, lack of access to formal markets. I mean, that's a lot of people. That could be somebody with a felony on their record that no one will hire. Could be somebody with a prostitution charge. that carries stigma with it that no one will hire, even though it's a misdemeanor, not a felony. It could be somebody with no skills that can't get a job in the formal economy right now because there's 10 million people who are unemployed. Whatever the reason, we all need access to income. We simply do. And so if somebody cannot access the formal economy, they will access the informal economy. And if they're not on the books and they're not keeping good records, right, someone could exploit that. So I'm not suggesting that everyone who's working under the table is being trafficked. If they're being paid and treated well, they're not being trafficked, even though it may be, illegal. But if they aren't being paid and they're being coerced to stay in that situation, then they likely are being trafficked. So I just wanted to pause here and say that, we tend to think of trafficking victims as these people that we don't know, that don't live in our community, these others. It's really much more common than we think. It's much less romantic than it is romanticized in the movies or sensationalized on TV. It's happening on these day-to-day experiences. I need to shower. I'm experiencing homelessness and I'm transgender. Well, there are, 2 resources for me in the whole greater Denver area as a transgender adult. And so what am I going to do? If I need a place to stay and a shower, I'm going to trade sex with somebody I know that lets me stay at their place so that I can get that shower and have that safe place to stay. So it's playing out on these much smaller scales than we tend to think. I won't spend too much time here, but I will say that people often, as a human trafficking professional, will tell me that, did I know that trafficking was really terrible in Denver? It's the worst city, or it's the 3rd worst city, or trafficking is really bad along I-70 and I-25, so that's why we have so much trafficking in Colorado. And while some of those things are true, really, trafficking happens in all the states. We actually have a much better, more robust response here in Colorado. We've had an anti-trafficking movement here since 2002, I think. And so that's much older and more robust than other states. And so we have higher prosecution numbers. And so it may appear, if you only looked at the list of prosecutions, that we have more trafficking here, but it's not the case. We just have more prosecutions of trafficking. There's highways in every state, there's industries that can sort of lend themselves to exploitation in every state. But here are some in Colorado. So agriculture, ranching, energy, tourism, ski resorts, construction. These are all industries with less regulation. And they're even less regulated during COVID because people aren't making home visits. They're not checking out living facilities. These are also industries that happen in remote communities, as well as in the city, of course. We see high immigrant populations, high turnover, low wage. So these are all factors that can contribute to trafficking in Colorado. We do have I-25 and I-70. We also have 50 and 550 and Highway 9 and 91. And so these are all kind of known transfer routes for trafficking of both drugs and humans. We've got Denver International Airport. It's the only international airport within a 600-mile radius. And we've got a massive commercial sex industry, and that will come as no surprise to you all, considering the work that you do, but does come as a surprise to some. Regardless of what you think, we likely know people who purchase sex, and you can't know if the person you're purchasing sex from is doing it voluntarily or not. I by no means, I am well aware that there are sex workers here in Colorado that are, selling sex willingly in order to meet their needs for work, and some feel very empowered in that work. But the demand for commercial sex also increases the demand for humans in general. And so we have sex trafficking victims tied up in this situation. I've met people experiencing homelessness in Denver during some of our outreach, young women who will say things to me like, I was taken to the mountains and I was drugged for 3 weeks, and then I was just dropped off on the side of the road back in Denver 3 weeks later. And I don't even really remember what happened. That's more common than we think. So again, people getting played on their experience of homelessness, maybe their substance misuse is being taken advantage of, and then they're brought up to Summit County where they're sold to tourists for sex against their will under threats of violence, right? So we see all of these factors contributing to trafficking here in Colorado. And again, I keep picking on Google and I keep picking on all of these other experiences, but we have to shift our minds to be thinking more inclusively around who is getting trafficked. It's often people who are perceived as unworthy. They're told they made bad choices. That's how they ended up in this situation. If they weren't a sex worker, then this would have never happened. If they came into the country legally, this would have never happened, right? If they didn't run away, or if they weren't experiencing homelessness, if they weren't using substances. But these are the kinds of experiences that we see intersecting with exploitation. And so if we Google trafficking, this is what comes up, right? Usually over-sexualized young females, usually white or Asian, and it's sex trafficking, and this is the narrative. And this does happen, right? Young girls are trafficked for sex, and it is horrific, and it should be stopped. But the problem with this ideal victim, or this common narrative, is twofold. One is that as service providers, this is all we're looking for. We're looking for over-sexualized young females being trafficked for sex only. It's only females, it's usually young people. And so this is all we look for. And so this is all we find. And then this is all we can ever prosecute. And so it's like cyclical, right? It's feeding into the narrative. And the problem with that is that not only are we missing it as service providers, but the people who are experiencing the crime, the victims, are also missing it. They don't see themselves in the common narrative, so they don't know to ask for help. They don't know that what's happening to them is in fact trafficking. Just like many of you probably didn't know that human trafficking included strawberry pickers sometimes. Strawberry pickers also don't know that. And so people aren't asking us for help. They're not seeing themselves in the common narrative, and they don't know where the resources are. And so I want to spend this last 15 minutes talking about identification and resources. I'm not going to try to explain, the complex trauma that happens to somebody's brain when they experience trafficking, because I suspect that many of you, given the nature of your work, have had this kind of training before. I would just like you to reflect on that. Human trafficking happens in multiple different ways. So people are experiencing multiple different forms of trauma at the same time, over time, repeatedly, right? So this is a complex form of trauma. And we know what happens to the brain when someone experiences complex trauma is it gets stuck in survival mode. It gets stuck in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And so that makes it challenging for self-identification and for outside identification, because people don't see themselves as victims, and so they don't ask us for help. And sometimes they're mad at us, right? And sometimes they accuse us of, also being a perpetrator, or they tell us we don't understand, or we couldn't possibly understand what they're going through, and they're probably right. So because of that trauma, we see shame and embarrassment. People are ashamed of the choices they make. They're embarrassed of the things that they've done or that have happened to them. They have a sense of duty or loyalty to their trafficker, because again, their traffickers are their parents, their employers, their teachers. There's obviously fear, and there's a mistrust of institutions or law enforcement. And I'm not, coming down on institutions or law enforcement in particular. It's just that so many of our systems have failed these victims at this point. People have missed it. The schools missed it. The mental health providers missed it. Law enforcement missed it, and they punished someone for crimes that they were forced to commit. And so there's just a lack of trust in general. And so how that shows up for us is people refuse our assistance. They show no emotion whatsoever. They're uninterested in cooperating, or they're irritable or uncooperative. There are so many complexities to this identification. In addition to all of that, there's language barriers. It could be the English language barrier, or it could be not having words to put to your experience. Being unaware of or unable to access rights, feeling that you're unable to access your rights, not knowing what your rights are because you're young, or because you're not from this country, or because no one ever told you. I mean, whatever the reason. Social or physical isolation. Traffickers will isolate their victims, just like people do with domestic violence or sexual assault, physically or socially. No one's ever going to believe you. You're useless. You have nowhere to run to, that kind of thing. And then we've already mentioned the rest of them. So most survivors won't ask for help. And so when you have clients that are coming in who've experienced domestic violence or sexual assault or something related, you need to be looking for these other kinds of red flags. not that it's super easy to make an identification, but perhaps if somebody is willing to accept that they've already experienced some of these other crimes, they may also come to see that they've experienced trafficking as well, and seek resources to support that. So, you know, none of these is cut and dry. None of these is like 1 + 1 = trafficking. But unexplained injuries, potentially, you want to be thinking about these as a constellation. Have I seen 3 or 4 or 5 of these? And that's when my protocol should kick in. Evidence of prolonged infection or time since injury, right? It's likely that if someone's being controlled by someone else, that they're not being allowed to go seek medical attention when they need it. And so it's not until it's really bad that they're going to seek medical attention. So a really bad infection, a break that didn't heal properly, that kind of thing. Signs of malnourishment, malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion. These basic human needs are being leveraged to control somebody. So people are kept up for days at a time. They're exhausted, they're hungry, they're thirsty, which makes them much less likely to run and more likely to comply, right? Exposure, repeated motion injuries, cardiovascular and respiratory. We see this in both sex and labor trafficking, because a lot of both take place outside. So people aren't wearing the proper safety equipment, or they're not wearing the proper clothing to protect them from the sun or from the elements. Sometimes people are breathing in chemicals while they're, you know, cleaning or while they're farming, because the owners are being careless with the farm and dropping pesticides on people while they're working. We do see some tattoos or branding. The common ones, of course, not everyone with a neck tattoo is being trafficked, you know what I mean? But we do see some common tattoos. We see a pimp's name with the date of initiation, or we see queen crowns, or we see like suits like spades, clubs, diamonds, hearts. Those are common. More common, I suppose. There are more like horrific and obvious ones. Like there was a young girl who had like an arrow on her abdomen that was like pointing at her vagina, that was like, enter here. So some more kind of obvious tattoos as well. You know, substance misuse, I should just say, is used often. So people are using substances to control their victims. So they either play on an already existing addiction and front someone drugs, and then they owe them, or give them the drugs that they want, and then they'll do what they say, or take them away, and then they'll do what they say. And sometimes people are just forced to use drugs constantly to stay compliant. Someone who has numerous inconsistencies could be lying to protect their trafficker, lying because they're afraid of getting prosecuted for crimes that they were forced to commit, or lying because they're not lying. It just sounds like lying. They've just experienced trauma and they can't remember things in a linear way, and it sounds like an inconsistency. Someone who's claiming to speak before or on behalf of somebody else, that's a big one. I'm sure you see this with domestic violence and sexual assault as well. So it's not that hard to kind of think about what might be happening in trafficking, but I'll give you an example of a labor trafficking situation. We had a labor trafficking victim. He was a sheep herder in the northwest part of Colorado, and he got a massive head injury, and his trafficker, his boss, brought him to the hospital and just said, "Oh, I speak Spanish, like I'll do the translating for you." And they were like, "Great," because we don't. And instead of getting a translator, they allowed him to translate. And that the individual didn't even speak Spanish. He spoke an indigenous language from Peru. And so he had no idea what was happening to him. No idea what the healthcare providers were saying. Nobody asked him any questions directly, and they just sent him out back with his trafficker back to the ranch. So please be sure to separate people from people that they come in with. That is super, super important. I've already mentioned the IDs. You know, someone who has relationships with an older unexplained adult could be trafficking, or could be like their uncle. I mean, we don't want to jump to conclusions, but you know, if someone has a sexual relationship with an older unexplained adult, it could be trafficking if there's some kind of money or something of value being exchanged, or it just could be, you know, statutory rape or sexual assault or child abuse. I mean, it could be lots of things. So it's not necessarily trafficking. There has to be that commercial component. Okay, so I know that was a lot. I just have 2 more slides here. So you can go ahead and start to put questions into the chat if you'd like. I want everyone on the call to be aware that if you are a mandatory reporter of child abuse, then you are also a mandatory reporter of child, both sex and labor trafficking. These are new laws, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of them. So child sex trafficking became officially a part of the child abuse and child welfare space in 2016. It went into effect in 2017. So basically, before that, if someone was being trafficked by a parent or guardian, it was a form of child abuse necessitating a child welfare response. But now, even if it's being perpetrated by a third party, like a pimp from up the street, then it's also a form of child abuse. So you'd be a mandatory reporter of that. And then in May of last year, we added child labor trafficking to that. So you would follow whatever protocol you had for child abuse in that same space. All child welfare, this same law mandated that all Colorado child welfare agencies be trained. They have not yet been, but we're working on it. So we're probably about 50% through the state right now. Our organization is helping child welfare to get their folks trained. There's still a lot of misunderstanding about this. This last slide here is, it's your biggest resource. So, you know, this training was just an hour. It was sort of a brief talk about, you know, how this might intersect with your work. So if you have additional questions, if you want to talk through a scenario in an anonymous capacity, you can call this hotline. We are a tip and referral hotline. We're 24/7. The folks have been trained by myself and lots of other service providers from across the state in immigration, in legal issues, in sexual assault, and motivational interviewing, and so many other things. They go through 50 hours of training, as well as 12 continuing education per year, 12 hours. And so they're human trafficking experts. So they can talk through a scenario with you. They can identify resources in your area. We have 340-ish resources from across the state that support victims of trafficking. Many of them are domestic violence and sexual assault resources, actually, who have been trained by us and will also offer their resources to victims of, or survivors of trafficking. We can report a tip. If you call in about someone who's under the age of 18, then we're mandated to report that because we're child abuse mandatory reporters as well. But if the person is 18 or over, then of course we believe in autonomy and self-determination. So we will only report if they want us to. But just so you know, when we do report to law enforcement, we have relationships with 46 of the 64 counties in Colorado. We're working on relationships with all 64 counties and really strong working relationships with the FBI, Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and State Patrol. So when we call a law enforcement officer, it's someone that we know and trust, who understands the nuances of human trafficking and will not arrest somebody for crimes that they're forced to commit as a result of their trafficking. Of course, a survivor can call or text us as well. It doesn't have to be you all. But sometimes survivors want a service provider to call on their behalf. Sometimes you might want to just give this number out. So make sure you just take out your cell phones and put these numbers in now. Do it, because you won't have these with you later. So I'm going to end there. I highly recommend developing a protocol. It can be something simple, like if we, you know, a list of red flags and behavioral cues, followed by the numbers to call and who we you know, mandatory reporting requirements and those kinds of things. So, oh, whoops, I didn't mean to get to that actually. Thank you, Sabrina. Oh, well, yeah, so, well, I don't know what percentage actually get shut down. We did have a huge bust actually 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, something like that, of massage parlors in Denver. But it takes time. I mean, calling in for a tip, you know, it's not like they just go in and bust the place open and shut it down. It's likely that they may already have an investigation going on. They're collecting data. Maybe they start monitoring a new massage parlor, but it's not like you call it in and it gets shut down tomorrow, right? They have to have proof. So yeah, if an investigation was initiated, maybe they didn't find anything. Maybe it was part of the bust. I don't know what your tip was, but 7 people were indicted on felony charges of trafficking. So that was a really big win. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kara. This has been an amazing amount of information, and thank you so much for all of what you do too. And just as a reminder to those on the call, for members, who have access to our online learning center, we also just put up a new human trafficking course this summer. So there's more information, tons of information that Kara has shared, as well as some additional intersections with domestic violence. Feel free to let me know if you ever have questions about that, and if any questions come up, we can always get you connected with Kara as well, and she just put her contact information. Actually, Kara, will you put that to everybody?
Oh, didn't I?
Yeah,
It says
sorry.
all panelists. Oh,
Yeah,
you're a panelist. Got it.
yeah.
All panelists and attendees.
It
Okay,
happens.
yeah, I'm putting my email in there now. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. These trainings are free, and we are facilitating them all virtually now, which makes it easier sort of to reach people. So reach out to me anytime if you want another training, or of course we have much deeper dives into all things human trafficking related. So reach out to me anytime.
Yes, wonderful. And if you all wouldn't mind taking a survey and let us know if there's more you want to learn about, whether it's human trafficking or other topics, that's always really helpful. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you again, Kara. This has been wonderful, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Everyone take care of yourselves today. Go eat some ice cream.
Awesome.